All right, hello everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the sixth event in the Winter-Spring 2023 iteration of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the Pop Conference. Thank you to my co-organizers, Francesca Royster, Gus Stadler, Eric Weisbard, and Carl Wilson. On March 20th, Dan DiPiero will be here to talk about Contingent Encounters, Improvisation in Music and Everyday Life, published by University of Michigan Press, and he will be in conversation with Christine Capitola. And in case you're unaware, you can find previous recorded sessions on Eric's YouTube channel. Today, we're excited to have Timothy R. Hoover and R.J. Smith here, and they will discuss their respective biographies, Soul Serenade, King Curtis and his Immortal Saxophone, and Chuck Berry and American Life. Timothy R. Hoover is an avid music lover who's spent more than 20 years researching and writing about the life of King Curtis. He has been a freelance writer for Hittin' the Note magazine, and this is his first published book. R.J. Smith has been a columnist for The Village Voice, an editor at Los Angeles Magazine, a contributor to Details, Spin, and Blender. He's been a visiting community scholar at the Getty Research Institute and a visiting scholar at USC's Center for Multi-Ethnic and Transnational Studies. His first book, The Great Black Way, LA in the 1940s and the Lost African American Renaissance from 2006, won a California Book Award. His The Life and Music of James Brown was one of the New York Times 100 Notable Books of 2012. Smith's American Witness, The Art and Life of Robert Frank, 2017, profiles the late American photographer and filmmaker. His new Chuck Berry and American Life tells the story of Berry's life and impact and was called, quote, the best music book of the year, unquote, by Ken Tucker on NPR's Fresh Air. He has written for Yeti, Chemical Imbalance, Grand Royal, Maggot Brain, and Men's Vogue. Smith is an editor at Capital in Maine, a nonprofit publication focusing on income inequality in California. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Gus will moderate. Please put your questions and comments in the chat as they come to you, and Gus will find them there at the end of the discussion. Feel free to also post comments throughout the conversation. So now I will turn things over to Timothy and RJ.
Hi. Well, I won the coin toss or lost it. I'm going to go first. And well, thank you for that awesome introduction. And Tim, it's really great you've spoken on the phone. It's great to see you here.
Agreed.
And I want that room you're in.
I live in a big long home in the mountains of Wyoming, so it's pretty secluded and quiet and peaceful, but it's cold.
Well, we had talked about I would talk for 15 or 20 minutes and then pass the mic over to you, and
sure.
We'll take some questions. So I want to, Kim, thank you for that awesome introduction. And yeah, thank you, PMBIP, for this amazing series and including us both in this. I was lucky enough several years ago to speak with Sana Retman about this project when it was just somewhere in the middle. I would ordinarily fear repeating myself, if only I think that recording was yanked off YouTube for obscure reasons. So canceled, the man. So hopefully we can achieve more notoriety this week, but staying on the YouTube channel this time. So yeah, I have a crucial scene that recurs in my mind from the Chuck Berry biopic that I imagine, and it's early. It's in the early 1960s. Berry was sentenced to United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri prison. He'd been found guilty of violating the Mann Act, a felony that involved driving across state lines with a woman in order to perform, quote, immoral acts, unquote. He'd driven from Ciudad Juarez to St. Louis, having sex with a 14-year-old Native American girl whom he promised a job to once they got to St. Louis. He was one of the originators, and now was writing rock and roll songs in prison, working as an assistant in a federal facility that provided medical, dental, and mental treatment for inmates. It's 1963, and in this visual narrative, I imagine, Barry is at work in a physical therapy unit, which he was at the time, lifting, say, an elderly bank robber into a whirlpool bath. The radio is on as he works. Maybe it plays The Ventures' fresh cover of his hit, Memphis, Tennessee, released by Barry as a B-side in 1959 and by The Ventures in August of 1963. Or maybe the AM station plays the Beach Boys' Surfin' USA, released March of that year. The Beach Boys' first top 10 hit, Billboard would call it the #1 song of the year. Now, Surfin' USA was a transparent rewrite of Chuck Berry's Sweet Little 16, and eventually Brian Wilson would acknowledge that very much and has over the years. Barry would get a songwriting credit about 3 years later, but in 1963, listening to the radio, hearing his song introducing the Beach Boys to a growing rock and roll audience, what must he have felt, this federal prisoner? You know, it must have been like feeling a wave hit you as you are being held down. Later that year, he was released from Springfield and resumed his career in music, and that career was not the same. To me, that moment is powerful, and it's an intersection of a lot of things that I talk about in my book. The moment when a form he never claimed to invent, "It's been here," he exclaimed to an interviewer in 1959, but which he had established the best blueprint for. It's proceeding forward out of his control. The moment when a poet of Black mobility is incarcerated, not found guilty of rape, say, but of driving across state lines for immoral purposes. The moment when a musical act of collective creation presented in performance is incorporating as a business. The moment when Black authorship and an undefined audience is being pushed aside and white listeners are bonding with new white performers. A year later, the Beatles' great version of Roll Over Beethoven would be released in the US. There's a really revealing account of the Beatles coming to the US in their second year in Tim Hoover's book, because King Curtis and the Kingpins were selected by Sid Bernstein to be the opening act for the Beatles when they played Shea Stadium, and then I think for several weeks after. At first, they all shared a plane, as Tim writes, and then after a few shows, the Beatles and the opening acts traveled separately. He quotes Kingpin's drummer Ray Lucas saying, "After that tour was over, we had to sign a waiver. We couldn't associate ourselves with the Beatles at all. We couldn't even have a marquee outside a club that said, 'Just back from a tour with the Beatles.'" The artists got along great, but a hierarchy was being asserted. Chuck Berry was born in 1926, and Curtis, is it Owsley or Ousley?
Owsley.
I'm sorry, Owsley.
Yep.
Curtis Owsley was born 8 years later. I think that's just enough of a gap to become over time a major breach. Beatles manager Brian Epstein never bothered to get a piano for that Shea Stadium show. Basically, he said the Beatles don't need a piano. King Curtis and the Kingpins needed one. As he shows, Tim does, King Curtis was not going to let that get in the way of playing for 50,000 plus people that day, and they played a great show. I'm pretty sure Chuck Berry, always eager to exploit a promoter's error, would not have been anywhere near as zen as Curtis was. Both of them were in a constant state of redefining themselves and looking for viable strategies for getting their music across in a business and structure that was not static. And their approaches and ability to adapt were massively different. I'm looking forward a little bit later, perhaps, to talking about the similarities and differences more. One side of King Curtis that came through to me in Soul Serenade is how much he lived in whatever moment engulfed him. He was able to drop in on a session, run a band, join Aretha's band. He opened outward to music around him in a way that Chuck Berry, at least after 64 or 65, did not do. I thought I'd offer some thoughts. The key change here offers a few thoughts on the process that I experienced writing this book and assorted matters. My book was not one I could have done in Chuck Berry's lifetime. I started it after he died in 2017. You know, there's he would have been an obstacle. I think people remained often reluctant to talk about experiences sometimes with Chuck Berry. They would have been even more so in his lifetime. And we can talk about it or not talk about it later, but I think publishers are very jumpy about publishing an unauthorized biography in an artist's lifetime for good and troubling reasons. Let's see. So I finished it in 2022 when the last copy edit was in place, basically. Hachette, my publisher, wanted it in 2 or 3 years, and they let me work on it for 5 years, knowing the book would be better for it. Even so, you know, for me, I'm never done until they stop me. There's a scrapbook that went on, a scrapbook that Chuck Berry had put together that went on view at the Mercantile Library in St. Louis as the fact checking was going on. And I so wanted to get down there and talk my way into having them take the scrapbook out of the case and look at it to incorporate that, and didn't get anywhere with that. But in terms of organizing, for me, I know there's software and resources for storing notes and making timelines and organizing chapters, and I've explored none of it. So feel free to okay boomer me. I'm interested in exploring a lot of that going forward, or some of it is useful. That said, for me, it's just part of the process that I'm used to create lots of files, files for notes from books, papers, interviews, periodicals, other files or interview transcripts, a file for stray thoughts, 4 a.m. I know there's a master timeline, of course. That's the first thing I try to form. And then it gets larded over time with stray thoughts and questions as much as it does with dates and record releases. At some point before I start, I'm outlining chapters, and at that point culling material for from all the files. And no doubt I do a lot of rummaging. Where did I put it? But I find it incredibly useful to lose a few things and find them. It reacquaints myself with the sum of a huge amount of material, and it starts to help me form connections with the material and the research that I would not see otherwise. I'm always thinking about, especially with a longer project like this Chuck Berry book was, I'm always thinking about structure, looking for ways to create connections between material, echo quotes throughout the book, come back to things that were said or ideas that were said in one context earlier, and find a way back to something meaningful later on. And looking for material in various files has been super useful for me in doing that and drawing the threads more tightly around the finished structure. I try to interview as many people as I can, at least 100. Now, unless I keep writing about folks from the 1970s onward, I'm thinking that's going to become impossible, or I'm interviewing people without firsthand experience, perhaps. I mostly type my interviews as we're talking them, save when I'm interviewing a lawyer or interviewing someone I know is providing a foundational structure or set of things that I need to know. I'll record that and transcribe later. But I am a good enough typist that I can do that and save myself a year of transcribing or something that would perhaps entail otherwise. I saw a great panel maybe 2 years ago at the Pop Conference. It was about doing oral history work, though I believe really it was kind of also about more generally profiling or interviewing individuals, interviewing subjects, maybe more than composing a formal oral history. Those have their own standards and practices. A panelist I was on this panel told a story about having a conversation with someone who sounded to me, I'm just guessing here, like they were a journalist. And if I remember that conversation being recounted correctly, the panelist and the other person were talking about the work they do and the practice of interviewing, the person saying, well, if I really want to get something out of a subject, sometimes to get something interesting, useful, an answer not rehearsed, they found that asking their subject questions while they were driving was a great way to get answers. And the panelists recounted that conversation, making a point about how that crossed a line. They would never do that. It was trickery of the interviewee somehow, or that when you sat down with them, you were obligated to tell the story as they gave it to you. And those are probably a little extreme polarities I'm accounting. That might be a condensation of what I only somewhat remember. Getting your best stuff and being properly respectful of a subject. But I've thought about that a lot, and I think about that back and forth a lot. And it's important to writing, not just biography, but historical accounts, I think, to kind of think about it sometimes. The process of tugging information or stories or memories out of folks who may not offer them off the top of their head, or the first time you ask them, they just don't remember it. That's a huge part of how I get material, especially new material that's not always a part of the record. So I say no to texting and driving, and I do sometimes talk and drive. For me, if a subject surprises me with something as I'm walking or driving with them, or whatever non-interview sit-down context, something happens, if what they say is shocking or inflammatory, I ask them later again. I definitely think if it has set off an alarm for me, I make sure I heard it correctly. I talk to them about it. Or if there's a context for what is said, I ask about that. But I may well want to use what they said. I want to use the best material I have. Interviews are conducted in all kinds of ways. Let's see, writing about Robert Frank or James Brown, or now especially Chuck Berry, the responsibility I feel is not to write an account that they would approve of exactly or be happy with, which is dangerous to expect and problematic in other ways. But I do want to present their lives fully and fairly. And, if there were multiple accounts or explanations of a thing that happened, to present those as well to the reader. With Chuck himself, if I held on to the recommendation he made, I try to hold on to the recommendation he made not long before he died in 2017 at a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame event. He was asked, how did he want to be remembered? After I'm gone, he said, I want you to just speak the truth, be it pro, con, bad, good, whatever it be. I just hope it's real. So I'll stop there. Turn over to Timothy Hoover, author of the new Soul Serenade now. I want to ask a question first. I really want to start at the beginning, Tim. What drew you to King Curtis's music, and what then made you want to write about his life?
Well, it's one of those serendipitous occurrences. I was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, my home state. I was at a David Sanborn concert in 1994. And the second set came out and played his version cover of King Curtis's Soul Serenade. And I'd been looking for a bluesy kind of soulful saxophone player, and I wasn't happy with anybody had found yet. And this song just knocked me for a loop. And I'm obsessive enough where the next day I had to know everything there was to know about this King Curtis gentleman. So I'd never heard of him before. And the more I researched, the more I listened. There's a very famous, it's still in business, record shop in downtown Minneapolis called the Electric Fetus. That was clearly opened in the 60s and 70s, but I'd go there quite a bit. And I just kept asking myself, the more I learned, why is nobody writing this man's story? And honestly, was obsessing over it, never written anything before. I was waiting for some really accomplished, famous, well-read journalists like, R.J. Smith to come along and write Curtis's story, because I just felt it deserved that kind of attention. After 6 years, nobody had come forward. And so in 2000, I decided, well, darn it, I'm going to write this man's story. And the first person I called was Jerry Wexler. And a number of people who've interviewed me have said, well, that was ballsy. You called Jerry Wexler. Well, if Jerry won't talk to me, and if Ahmet Ertegun, founder and president of Atlantic Records, won't talk to me, I probably can't write the story very well. So I didn't want to waste my time or anybody else's time. So I called Jerry up and he said, call me back in 3 weeks, and hung up on me. And I called him back in 3 weeks. And he said, call me back in an hour. And I hung up on me. And I'm wondering, is this interview going to go south or what's going to happen? And so I get Jerry on the phone and he says, now, what have you written, Mr. Hoover? And I think the thing that, like you're talking about with Chuck Berry wanting to be honest and open, just tell the truth. I was very transparent with everybody I've talked to. And I said, I've written nothing, Mr. Wexler, but I need your help. And I can't write this story accurately enough without your help. Will you help me? Well, of course I will. And he gave me this marvelous 45-minute interview, sent me previously unpublished photos to use in the book. He was really marvelous. And so I thought, well, if Jerry Wexler is going to talk to me, I'll try Amit Ertegun. And made an appointment with Amit. He was delayed coming back from Detroit. So his secretary said, well, can Mr. Ertegun call you back in a couple hours? We want to keep the appointment because he really wants to talk to you. And he called me back and he was marvelous. Another half an hour of just really stunning information and insights and heartache because they missed him so badly, missed Curtis so badly. And of course, Amit, the first thing he says is, well, what have you written, Mr. Hoover? I've written nothing, but I need your help. Will you help me? And then from that point on, I had a lot of confidence because the people in the industry revere King Curtis. You and I've been talking and emailing back and forth over the last week, and I've been struck by the differences in Chuck Berry being a global star and changing music overtly around the world and, making music better. Curtis made musicians better. Everybody he recorded with, everybody he performed with, everybody he supported, nurtured, influenced, even producers, the Senator Jimmy Douglas, who's produced Jay-Z, Beyonce, Led Zeppelin. He was an 18-year-old producer just starting out at Atlantic Records, dating Jerry Wexler's daughter, and Curtis took him under his wing. When I interviewed Jimmy said, I've wanted to talk to somebody about this my whole life. So in the industry, King Curtis hits a chord with so many, many, many musicians because they were influenced from Bobby Keys with the Rolling Stones to all sorts of different artists. But that's the long version of how I got started into it. But once the ball starts to roll, and you may appreciate this, RJ, it's hard to stop because it's so much fun. The people were so gracious. And again, I've been very honest and transparent. Jerry Wexler told me some things and he said, please keep that off the record. And I honored that request. But I think you and I both, maybe Chuck had more, talk about not just the heyday and the popularity and the success. We talk about their warts because that's the truth. And I let the reader kind of determine what their opinion is on that kind of thing, as you do too. But again, both were transcendent talents, but Curtis was more covert, more, making his influence felt in the industry with some great music along the way, where Chuck was much more iconic and changing the world as far as guitar players go, along with Bo Diddley. Mickey Baker certainly was a great influence on the guitar world, although he's a studio musician. But it's been more wonderful than I can imagine. And my kids all know every song Curtis has done. They know all the albums he's produced. They have no choice, but they've been very supportive, as has my wife been too. But I'm just, once Curtis hits the coasters with his saxophone solo and Yakety Yak, he just changed the role of saxophone sideman forever. And now he's an international superstar and he can dictate who he wants to play with. And you and I were talking, 1966, January of 1966, a very young left-handed guitar player from Seattle, Washington auditions for King Curtis's band, and they hire him as the second guitar player, second to the lead guitar Cornell Dupree, and that young man was Jimi Hendrix. And King Curtis's band was hired by Chuck Berry to back him at an upstate New York college performance. And Jimmy, being Jimmy, found a spot where he could just take it out. And Jimi Hendrix stole the show, and Chuck Berry did not like that. In classic, alpha male headliner performer personality. But the Chuck Berry told King Curtis he was not happy with that. So Jimmy left after 6 months, went to England to become a superstar. And of course, who can argue with that decision?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can ask more questions, but
well, I mean, we can talk a little bit about Curtis, because after after Yakety Yak, he records with Buddy Holly, where Buddy Holly is so insistent on Curtis coming down and recording with him and his bass player Waylon Jennings that Buddy pays Curtis's airfare, hotel, all the expenses, has 14-year-old Bobby Keys pick King Curtis up at the Amarillo airport and take him to Clovis, New Mexico. And Bobby Keys ends up being the star saxophone player for the Rolling Stones. But you got, 1962, Curtis has a #1 hit. 1963, he tours with Sam Cooke and records probably one of the top 10 greatest live R&B soul albums of all time, Sam Cooke Live at Harlem Square in 1963. And it is raucous. It is a raw, coarse Sam Cooke. It's King Curtis wailing away. If anybody out there has not listened to that album, do yourself a favor, because if you listen to that album and it doesn't pick you up and shake you by the collar, Sam Cooke urging you on and urging the audience on, doesn't shake you by the collar, you have no soul. That's a big statement. But and then again, you alluded, RJ, he signs with Capitol Records in 1962 or 63. Beatles hire him to open for them at Shea Stadium in 1965, and then the subsequent tour after that. He breaks up his band, hires Jimi Hendrix. But 65, he signs with Atlantic Record. But 1967, Aretha signs with Atlantic Record. And now those two have cemented as big brother, little sister at Atlantic Records for the rest of their tenure together. And Aretha always felt like she was more comfortable, more at ease with King Curtis, her band leader and saxophone player behind her, along with the Kingpins band. But you've got everybody from, Otis Redding wanted to go on tour with King Curtis in late 1968. And 67. And Curtis and Otis couldn't agree on any kind of contractual obligations to tour together. So Otis said, fine, I'll go on tour and we'll talk about this later. Well, within a week or two of this, he dies in a plane crash in Lake Monona, Wisconsin. So King Curtis should have been on Otis Redding's fateful plane the day Otis died. And then you've got discovered Donny Hathaway. And this is a little personal favorite of mine, but on Donny's debut album for Atlantic Records, Everything is Everything, Curtis co-produced that album with Donny. And they decided, as producers and artists do, which we record on the record, what original material, like The Ghetto, what cover should we do? They decide on covering Errol Garner's Misty, one of the most arguably covered jazz songs in all of modern music. Donny Hathaway is going to cover Misty on his debut album for Atlantic Records. And if you listen to his version, it's hair-raisingly good. It's gospel. It's our soul. It's his entirely own song, not unlike what Aretha did to Respect by Otis Redding. She turned it into her own song. And that's Curtis on the song Respect with that blaring saxophone solo. And incidentally, I'll back up. On the song Respect, earlier in that day at Atlantic Records Studios, Sam and Dave from Stax Records were recording, and they were recording When Something's Wrong with My Baby. And Aretha Martin, the producer of Aretha's album, got together with King Curtis that afternoon as they're recording Respect. And they said, we need a break here for the saxophone. And Aretha or Curtis, somebody said, well, do you remember When Something's Wrong with My Baby? It's kind of an unusual modulation. When something's wrong with my baby. So listen to Curtis's sax solo. And that's what he does. He copies that. It's an interesting modulation to make that Respect just a smack in the mouth sax solo feminist anthem, along with Aretha's fabulous lyrics and phrasing. So, but 1969 meets Duane Allman. 1970, King Curtis records with Eric Clapton, and he records only one song, and it's called Teasin'. And in Eric Clapton's autobiography, in an interview in 1980 for BBC Radio, he's asked, well, what's the one song in your career so far where you felt like you gave your all? And Eric Clapton kind of sighs a little bit and says, well, the first thing that comes to my mind is the one song I did with King Curtis, because that's the kind of impact King Curtis made on his fellow musicians. He didn't write a tremendous amount of music. He had some hit songs, but it's not like Chuck Berry. That's global, iconic, changing music. Curtis changed artists by his collaboration with them. I mean, back in the 50s, when he had just started out, they had a thing called, let me check my notes here. Oh yeah, they had what's called lead sheets. And when you had a backing musician, guitar player, saxophone, trumpet, they would get broad-based parameters by the producer on what the artist wanted them to do. And if you weren't very good at interpreting what the artist wanted to do, they wouldn't hire you back again. And Curtis knew how to maximize exactly what everybody wanted. When Lieber and Stoller hired him for the Coaster sessions with Yakety Yak, they whispered him a couple times, but Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller said, he knew exactly what to do every single time. And it wasn't just blues. It wasn't just R&B. It was soul. It was even a little country here and there and some jazz. But Curtis could interpret exactly what the studio musicians wanted him to do and the producer wanted him to do. And that's what made him so talented and what revered him in the industry. But yeah, and then obviously he's murdered in 1971 outside his mansion in New York City, which used to be the Gimbel department store mansion. It has a swimming pool in the basement, things like that. And I've become really, really close to his fiance, Modine Broughton, who's now Modine Brown. And I've spent days and days and weekends in her kitchen, talking to her, getting her on tape, talking about Curtis and musicians and insights into Jimi Hendrix, and Delaney and Bonnie and Friends, and Duane Allman specifically. And I've become very close to her. And that's the thing about the process that I didn't fully appreciate. I made some great friends. I met some really interesting, kind, supportive people. And you don't stick with something for 22 years and not give up unless you've been influenced by a lot of their love and a lot of their sadness. Jimmy Douglas again, urging me on to write the book. It had to be written. So this has been a great, wonderful travel for me. And again, I'm looking forward to talking about Curtis as much as anybody will listen to me.
Well, that's amazing. I wanted to ask, you talked a little bit about how Curtis died, and you had the experience of reaching out to the person who killed him.
Yeah.
At least getting them on the phone. What was the process like? And just talk about that. It's such an amazing moment.
Well, and I'll back up because the process is exactly the same as what I did with Sid Bernstein, who's the New York promoter that brought the Beatles to Carnegie Hall in 1964 and then Shea Stadium in 1965. And it was important to me because he's still alive, number one, but I wanted to know from Sid Bernstein, why King Curtis? And they had a number of other warm-up bands as well, but why King Curtis to perform at the most important moment of your whole life? Nobody had ever done an outdoor stadium concert before, 55,000 people. And he picked King Curtis. And so I wanted to talk to Sid Bernstein, and I'd call him every month at his office, every month. After 7-8 months, now it's kind of a game. And I wouldn't be mean about it. I'd call up and say, Mr. Bernstein, this is your monthly Tim Hoover call, and kind of laugh a little bit. And finally, I'm walking my little girl into St. Paul Children's Hospital. She's 7 years old. She's having some elective surgery, and my phone rings, and it's a New York area code. And I think it's a sales rep from the company I work for, the medical company. This is Tim Hoover. And this very New York-ish accent on the other end of the line says, Tim Hoover, are you sitting down? This is Sid Weinstein. So that same process, the kind of the water torture every month, I would call Juan Montanez, who stabbed King Curtis and murdered him. And I'd call every month. And so one time I'm in my car, I'm out to the mailbox because it's far away from the house. And I'll call Juan Montanez. And I have my tape recorder with me, because I always do. And I pick up and I say, hi, this is hello. And so is this Juan Montanez? Yes, this is Juan Montanez. And the hair on the back of my neck just stood straight up. And I said, well, Mr. Montanez, I've left you a few voicemails. This is Tim Hoover, the King Curtis author. I'd really like to talk to you about your perspective about the confrontation you had with Curtis. Click. And he hung up on me. And I'm not, I guess it was not unexpected. I don't blame him. He's 77 years old right now. And for all I know, his family doesn't even know he stabbed somebody to death. Yeah, I don't know. And he certainly, after 50 years wants to get past it. And I understand that too. So he wouldn't talk to me, but I understand why he wouldn't want to talk to me. But I did get a hold of him for a brief hi, but that's all.
The experience of being outside in all kinds of ways. I was born in 59, and I knew about Chuck Berry, but I first really connected with Chuck Berry, around the time of My Ding-a-ling.
Right.
And then other things transpired from that, and seeing him on film. How much was it sort of useful or liberating to have a distance, and how much of it was cause you to do that extra work or do the necessary work to make a connection with the people you needed to talk to?
Well, I mean, again, I've been so passionate and dogged about this, but it's been very emotional for me. It's been very personal. I can't tell you, I've lost track of the dozens and dozens of times a little voice in the back of your head, we all have it, says to me, who do you think you are? You can't write a book. No one's going to publish it. No one's going to buy it. And I would take Duane Allman's eulogy 13 days after Curtis is murdered. Duane and the Allman Brothers perform a live concert for WPLJ radio station in New York. And about the second set, Duane stops and has this really beautiful eulogy about Curtis. He misses his friend desperately, and he's really torn up about it. And then they start into a song called "You Don't Love Me," and into it evolves into "Soul Serenade," and it's this beautiful, lovely song. And then all of a sudden, Duane cuts it to shreds, and you can kind of feel him purging his soul of his sadness and his anger. And every time my momentum would start to slow, I'd put that on. And I honestly have listened to that eulogy and that song 45 times, 50 times over the last 20, 22 years. So that's kind of what kept me going. And that's the motivation, along with, I just felt that Curtis's story is just too important. And I still don't understand why nobody's written his story. You've seen magazine articles, you've seen blurbs here and there, or he's got a little section in somebody's book kind of thing. But he's just been everywhere. He recorded with over 200 artists during an 18-year span, as prolific as anybody in his era. And he was good. So I don't know if that properly answers your question, but that's kind of what motivated me and kept me going. Is wanting to get his story out, but also Duane Allman picked me up when I needed some help. Yeah, that's very personal to me.
Well, should we open it up to questions from the house?
We don't yet have any questions in the chat. Actually, I could ask a question, and please, others, go ahead and put things in the chat. Tim, one thing that was really interesting about when you wrote your proposal to us, that I was really interested in, was just sort of like the project of writing a book about a sideman, which I assume is like a big part of the reason that there hasn't been something written about Curtis before. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like the challenge of making the sideman kind of, or if you thought of it as a challenge of making them into like a compelling figure. I get it. It's a great question, but I let everybody else he played with make it compelling. If you hear Eric Clapton say, "This is my favorite recording I've ever done in my career to date," and it's King Curtis, and you go, "Who?" Aretha Franklin on Respect. Sam Moore has a 5-foot by 5-foot portrait of King Curtis over his fireplace right now, because Curtis produced Sam's first Atlantic Records solo album, and then it was shelved. Curtis was murdered. Sam was into drugs. I think it's compelling about the people around Curtis. Like I said, Curtis made musicians better by being around them, contributing. And so I think that's what's compelling to me is, Jimi Hendrix played in his band and people go, "What?" Eric Clapton, in my favorite song with King Curtis, "What? That's Curtis on the Coasters Yakety Yak and Charlie Brown. That's Aretha on Respect. That's Curtis." So I think that's what's compelling. It's the aha about Curtis. That's a sideman, but he was what a sideman. Again, when you've recorded with over 200 artists, that's got to get your attention. And so it wasn't hard to make the story compelling, it wasn't hard for me to feel it was compelling because of all the other people that were around Curtis and involved with Curtis. And that's what really grabbed my attention. I think that's what resonates with a lot of people that read the book too, is he opened for the Beatles, signed with Atlantic Records, Buddy Holly, Otis Redding should have been on this plane, Sam Cooke. And you just go, wow. So great question. But I think I let the people around Curtis make it compelling, not so much Curtis, but because he was around all these people, I think now it becomes compelling because you want to know more about who King Curtis is.
Good, thank you. We have a couple of questions now. Tim Riley, do you want to unmute and ask your question? I think you're still muted, or we can't hear you, at least. You still can't hear you. Are other people not hearing him?
No, I don't hear him.
Okay, it doesn't say that you're muted, so I guess I'll just ask the simple version of your question, which is, did King Curtis ever play a session with James Brown?
No, never played a session with James Brown. Never was on. He may have been at Apollo Theater, music events. A lot of the big music events they had in New York City. Many times King Curtis was in the backing band, even in the recording studio. If it was an all-white band with all-white musicians, King Curtis was generally the only black musician in the studio band. But so Curtis was on stage at the Apollo Theater, a lot of Alan Freed shows, and I'm sure he crossed paths with James Brown, but they didn't do any specific work together.
I had a question. I wonder, what about who he was made him so able to live in that moment? How he wasn't simply flexible, but he was comfortable in different contexts that are so, it's a great skill to have, and it's kind of a rare skill. And I wonder where it came from, or how you account for it.
Well, Curtis was big for his generation, 6'2" and 200 pounds. And Clarence Clemens kind of patterned himself after that. The original big man was King Curtis. But I think he just had supreme confidence in himself, developing his music and his talent in Fort Worth, Texas, playing in all white clubs one night, all black clubs the next, and being the chameleon, instantly knowing exactly what his audience wants. I think that's the self-confidence that Curtis developed. He went to visit his uncle, senior in high school in New York, and entered the Apollo Theater Talent Night contest on Wednesdays and won 2 weeks in a row. So as you're going back to Fort Worth, Texas, he's got the knowledge that he stacks up pretty well with the local competition and decides to eschew music scholarships to colleges and go to New York City right away, where he meets, Mickey Baker, Doc Pomus, and really kind of took off. But I just think from the age of high school, he had just supreme confidence in himself, aside from being a hothead, which ultimately kind of was his downfall, but he was just super confident in himself. And I think that's why he succeeded.
Thanks. Okay, Brian Wright, do you want to unmute?
Can I do one? I don't mean to hijack the whole thing, but I
should go for it. Yeah.
Hey, everybody. So yeah, I guess I'm going to hijack and talk about things I'm interested in, because both these are such fascinating figures here for kind of the work I do in some ways. So I write about the history of the electric bass in the 50s and 60s, and kind of both of your work intersect with that in really interesting ways. So my question for Tim was, coming out of conversations I've had with like Jerry Jamont and Chuck Rainey and some of the guys who played with Curtis, there seems to be this weird thing that happens, and you talk about it in the book, where like Curtis keeps a separate band that he works with in the studio and the live band, and he doesn't mix them. And then later on, when the live band changes, he doesn't help them get their foot in the door in the scene necessarily. And so I was wondering if you could just speak to this might just be pure speculation, but I've always been really fascinated of in some ways he was this very prominent figure in the New York session scene, but isn't using his power to necessarily open the door for the rest of the young guys he's helping out. I was wondering if you thought, had any ideas of where that might have come from.
Well, I think Curtis was, again, being very self-confident. Curtis had an idea about what he wanted to do and how things were done. And I think, oh, hang on a second, my dog just came home. But I think honestly, he was a superb judge of talent. But at the same time, I think he liked holding on to his talent. I don't think he wanted them being any bigger than they could be. But if to a man, anybody I interviewed who was King Curtis in his original band, King Curtis and the Noble Knights with Ray Lucas, King Curtis and the Kingpins, Cornel Dupree, Jerry Jamont, Bernard Purdie. You ask them to a man, and it's an experience they've never had. It's spiritual, where they all felt we are the best band in music. And I wonder if Curtis felt, well, and rightly so, maybe, you're in the best band. Where else are you going to go? Who else do you want to play with? But the people that played for Curtis, with Curtis in his bands, are so loyal to him. And you read in the book, people feel like it's almost kind of a spiritual experience where there's no band that can touch us when we're playing. And I think that's probably why Curtis was busy trying to be the best band he could be. And so why would you want to play with anybody else or do anything else? To the point where he didn't take Jerry Jamont into the recording studio right away. He wanted to keep Jerry Jamont down and just be on his line. Jerry didn't want to travel. Jerry Jamont's big goal in life was to be on vinyl. And so Curtis goes to Memphis and records at American Sound Studios, Memphis Soul Stew, but does not take his bass player Jerry Jamont. And that's curious to me. But like you said, Curtis wanted to keep his band separately. And I wonder if he just wanted to kind of keep people in their positions, but he also had great respect for their talents. And he was very picky. A couple members he'd pick here that didn't work out, but more times than not, he picked the cream of the crop, and they just took off together. So again, long-winded answer, but I think Curtis probably just wanted to keep things the way they are because he felt he had the best band. And why would you want to play with anybody else?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think Chuck's experience was obviously different than that over time. I mean, he certainly was a member of a unit at first. And even when he took over the band that Johnny Johnson had founded, there was a collaborative process very much at work. But over the years, well, a lot of things changed. And for Chuck, his relationship with his musicians around him really became complicated and unsatisfying for the most part, although not on all parts, for the musicians around him that he worked with from town to town. I think he saw them as, an obstacle or a backdrop for a way to demonstrate his own talents and his own skill at rising above their shortcomings. Although those quote unquote shortcomings were very much a part of the contractual relationship that he had established in the first place by not having a rehearsal, by not knowing their names before they came onto the stage often. So that became a big part of the shows over the years, of course, just that Barry, he played Chuck Berry music, and yet it was by rising above the surroundings that he defined a successful night, I think.
I saw a question, a question from Lucretia that asked, and this is probably good for RJ as well.
Yeah.
How to reconcile the troubles or troubling aspects of a musician with their music? And I think it's a superb question.
Yeah, I think we're going to go in order.
Oh, sorry.
We have a question from Lauren Omke before that.
Okay.
Thanks to you both. And RJ, congrats on the book. As somebody who worked with Chuck in real life in 2012 at the Rock Hall when we did the big tribute, it was definitely a challenge. But what I said is, I'm teaching a Birth of Rock and Roll class this term, and I just spent last week on Chuck Berry, and my students were really, kind of very focused on that, how little of the story has really been told about whatever we want to call it, Chuck and women over the years, including all the stuff at, the bathrooms and all of that. And they were really frustrated. And, I think they have a really sophisticated way in many ways of talking about contemporary artists dealing with this stuff. But I guess for you as a writer, how much of that stuff did you know when you started this project, and how did you sort of manage it as a writer and critic yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I knew the outline of it all, I guess. I knew sort of enough from what had been written, although a lot has not before, that I knew in general, there's always more people when you start looking for people who, well, not always, but in this case, the more you got the word out, the more people responded with their own stories. So that was there. I think, going to read the court records of the variety of lawsuits that happened in the late 80s and early 90s tied to the videotaping that he did in his restaurant and at Berry Park, that was sort of both new because no one's hardly ever looked at that stuff before. It's not in St. Louis. You kind of have to go a little out of town to get it. And it was all settled out of court, but there's thousands of pages of court records leading up to the agreement out of court that were interesting to look at. So I'm kind of losing the thread of the question, but
I guess what I'm really asking is how you were kind of navigating that as in writing the story. What did you come in knowing? How did it change the shape of what you ended up doing? Sorry for the long-winded question.
No, it's great. And I get so into answering one part of it that I lose the bigger part of it. Yeah, it was not fun sometimes. And I think that I've tried to do a full, though not complete, but a full portrait of the person, including that stuff, including, the Mann Act, prosecution, and the testimony that actually is a whole different set of issues than what he went to prison for. It was a lot, and I haven't. I talked to Lucy Sant about some of this once, actually, and Lucy had the experience of getting an amazing, and she's talked about this, amazing deal to write a Lou Reed biography, and had cooperation of Laurie Anderson and access to material that I believe other biographers have not had or will not have, perhaps. And Lucy along the way said recently, and I said this in print, that she changed the nature of the contract she had with her publisher because the way I'll put it, and this is not Lucy's way, is she didn't want that person living in her head anymore. She loved the music. She loved the music, and I believe not just with the Velvet Underground, but many things after that. But there's something about thinking about what Lou was about and why he made these, to sort of understand, the people that we're writing about. You don't have to like everything or maybe anything, I don't know, about them, but you have to get inside them to sort of figure out why they decided to do this and not that, and so on. And it kind of, it can be less fun with someone like Chuck, and definitely less fun with Chuck for sure, and fun's not even the right word, than compared to James Brown, I think. I feel like, or at least there's more of a language to talk about. We're on more familiar ground or more shared ground. Familiar is not quite right. Talking about some of the issues that I understand about James Brown's violence. And I feel like Chuck Berry's behavior and cruelty is less understood or less understood by me and more private and put me more in the realm of, not talking about trauma and social things that one can read in an op-ed page or something, but, things I want to talk about with a shrink to understand. And I am in no position to be that kind of authority. I kind of asked around and looked for some help, and it's just outside the scope of the book I could write. So yeah, I did an interview for a St. Louis afternoon show, and it was live, and it was 15 minutes, and they hadn't read the book, which is not a problem. Being open to what I'm saying is enough. Showing interest is enough. It could be better, but they started asking, we want to know, did you get into the bad stuff about Chuck? And this is a St. Louis, this is his hometown, and they weren't like shock jocks. They were like, I don't know what the word, but they were afternoon, and they wanted to talk about that. And I said, yes, I do talk about it, and I talk about it in this context, and you have to remember. And they kept coming back, and they would be like, well, we don't even want to talk about the IRS stuff. Well, we do want to talk about it, but let's go back to the other stuff. And it's, God, it was the longest 15 minutes I've had in a long time. And I understand the need to, I dove into that in the book, but their motives were frustrating to me. Anyway, so that's a long-winded answer to a very sharp question.
Thank you for that reflection. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into Lucretia Ty Jasmine's questions.
Yeah, I think settling the ethics of writing a music biography, and I made very sure that I was transparent to people. And not unlike RJ, I want to tell the story truthfully and just put out the facts and try to not to opine on one thing or another. I want to let the reader determine for themselves warts and bad things and how important that is to them, how impactful it is in their global view of the artist. I think it's just important to be honest. And again, Jerry Wexler, a number of people have told me things off the record, and it's off the record. So I have to be honorable with that, but also let them know I want to tell this story truthfully. My biggest fright was Modine Broughton, Curtis's fiance, when he was murdered. And I told her, I'm telling it truthfully. I'm going to talk about all of Curtis's warts, good and bad. Yeah, I just want to make sure that's how I'm going to do it. If you will talk to me, that's how I'm going to write it. And so being upfront like that, I think, was helpful for me. But also, I try to let the reader decide for themselves based on the facts and the truths what their opinions are.
Lucretia, I want to give you a chance do you want to unmute and ask your question directly?
Yeah, that's just so interesting. Everything you all are saying is so interesting. I just want to say that I just really loved, RJ, when you were talking about your actual writing process and the notes. And Timothy, I really related to what you said about being so personally connected to a piece of music and how it can help you keep going. And then in terms of reconciling troubling aspects of a musician with the music, like we live in such a cancel culture now, and who among us hasn't made huge mistakes that we regret? And who among us doesn't have horrible traits that we'd like not to have? Maybe it's a matter of degree. How do we keep loving the music and not let this other stuff just get in the way?
That's a tremendous question. I guess my opinion is the music will always move you. It may be tarnished by some of the unpleasant things you uncover about the artist. But I think the music will always move you, and it kind of maybe transcends the personality a little bit. I can't hate the music, but I can hate the person. Does that make any sense to you? So I just think that music is transcendent, and it's almost separate. But then, like you say, so eloquently, that the hardest part is reconciling that ethereal music with the artist. And if they're a dirtball, how do you do that? And I don't have a great answer.
Yeah. I guess I see it as almost a case by case basis. I certainly respect anybody
point.
who, who can't go to a certain artist anymore. I don't want to have an argument, with a friend or a family member over such an issue. And I, in terms of Chuck, you have to do some sorting out. And that was sort of one of the challenges that I gave myself, I guess, and kept me going through the pandemic writing this book, was trying to understand the artist and the human being, and to put them on the same page that way. But if someone said they can't listen to Chuck, and many people have, I wouldn't want to argue with them. I would want to say that, well, when I talk to those radio people, what I should have said, the classic, what I should have said if I had another 5 minutes. I mean, they're in St. Louis, and they have, streets named after Charles Lindbergh and the spirit of St. Louis. And, there's a racial double standard when Charles Lindbergh, who, was a Nazi sympathizer and undermined the World War II effort, an anti-Semite. He's perceived one way, I'm sure, by those DJs, and Chuck Berry is perceived another. But anyway, it is up to the individual. I wouldn't want to live in a world without Chuck Berry's music, but I'm sure if I had met Chuck Berry, well, I'm not sure what would have happened, but it's easy to imagine, various unpleasant things happening, or just, a journalist in St. Louis, a wonderful journalist who helped me out a lot, talked about seeing Chuck Berry perform at a Blueberry Hill show one night, and he wanted his autograph. So he looked for some paper, and he didn't have his paper, and he got a $5 bill. He pulled out the $5 bill and gave to Chuck to sign, and Chuck grabbed it and put it in his pocket and walked away. And it's kind of a better story than anything else that could have happened. And I think he signed it and walked back a little later and gave it back to the guy. But he was he tormented people.
We have another question from Tim. Can you tell us about King Curtis playing on John Lennon's rock and roll sessions 1974 to 75?
Well, so King Curtis was murdered on August 13th, 1971. And 9 weeks before that, first week in June, he was in studio with John Lennon at the power plant recording studio, doing overdubs for It's So Hard and Mama, I Don't Want to Die for John Lennon's Imagine album. So Curtis did work with John Lennon, and Wall of Sound producer wanted to have him come along and work with John Lennon. So it started back when John Lennon was very friendly in 1965 with the Beatles tour with King Curtis. They knew each other quite well. And John wanted to have 15, 20 different cuts of saxophone solos on over to John. And John finally came over to the States in June 1971 and kind of put everything together for the two songs. So there weren't any King Curtis sessions in 1974, 75, because he'd already passed away.
Rich Friedman, do you want to ask one of your questions?
Yeah, you talked about Duane Allman, who was gone not long after King Curtis, and yet the band stayed with us in one form or another with some breaks until 2014. Hendrix was doing some of his best work when he died. Janis Joplin was with a band that was better. I know people who saw them than Big Brother and that other band that she had. Where do you think Curtis would have gone in the 70s and 80s had he lived? I mean, we know about Bobby Keys and we know about Clarence Clemens. Those are the two sax names that come to mind in popular music. Where would Curtis have gone?
Well, I think it's best said by Bobby Whitlock, who played keyboard for Eric Clapton with Derek and the Dominoes, and then certainly Delaney and Bonnie and Friends. And I talked to him, and he said, had he lived, and maybe this is over the top, but again, this is someone in the inside. And again, Curtis's finest work was with musicians, making musicians better. And Bobby Keys said, had Curtis lived, he would have been a superstar on par with, and it's not jazz oriented, mind you, but on par with the Miles Davis of trumpet. Curtis would have been the Miles Davis of saxophone. He was just branching out into movie scores. He had been the band leader for the Soul TV PBS station, so he's getting the television. Curtis would have been iconic. I don't think that's too big a stretch, just based on the relationships he cultivated over an 18-year span and how in the industry he was revered. So, I mean, when you hear the Saturday Night Live band led by Lenny Pickett of Tower of Power, who was also influenced by King Curtis, and they open the show and the sax is wailing away, that's King Curtis. I can envision King Curtis playing for the Saturday Night Live band and being their band leader. That it's as talented as he was, I don't know if there's any boundaries on how great he could have been.
Okay, looks like our last question, Giannis, this is a very general question about process. I'm wondering if you could ask like some more specific question about some particular aspect of the process.
RJ, you want to take that one? I'll follow you.
What is the question?
Giannis, are you there?
Yes. I'm wondering in general about how do you make sure you have the maximal possible collection of archival material. How do you handle rejection for like interviews, conflicting material, and also if you have found archival material ex post facto after you wrote the book that you wish you had included, and how did you deal with that? And you know that the kind of fun part of the process.
That's a great question, and that's one of the issues or things that just they definitely I think about them all the time because there's always more, and another generation will uncover more letters or photographs or press accounts or the great lost interview. So there, the end comes when you're at, so all along the way, I'm looking for some kind of balance, checking what am I missing? What am I missing? Because time is going to run out. Where do I need to research, even if I've gotten some other research done? So looking for some kind of balance along the way. What was the other part of the question?
If you found material after you've done reading the book that you wish you had included or known, either material or factoids, or people volunteered, their input. They says, I wish I could have done that.
Oh.
Did you have that?
Well, there was the scrapbook that the family put on view at the Mercantile Library in St. Louis as pretty much about the time my book was going to press. And I sure wish I could have looked at that. But I also try to put aside once I'm done, once the book is out, it's out and it's done. And I don't get tired of the artists, but I don't want to, I want to free up some of the space on the hard drive, I guess. Or maybe the next subject, or just listen to more music. And not get too regretful about what I didn't get in.
But Giannis, that's a great question. I think after being at this for 22 years, I'd like to think I've exhausted and looked under any rock, any nook and cranny. I did run across a couple of things from Jet Magazine, which named King Curtis the best dressed entertainer for 1963. Things like that, I think that would be interesting. But I think it's best told by Paul Wexler, Jerry's son, who himself is a musician. And I called him up to give him the good news that the book is being published. And he said, "Congratulations for getting off the merry-go-round," because I could still be, as RJ could be, I could still be talking to people, digging up archival material. But at some point, you've got to stop to the best of your abilities and try to get the book out there to get the message out there. So it's a crapshoot. It's a guess many times, but I was pretty confident that I'd covered most everything as best I could, and it's time to get the message out.
All right. Thank you so much, Tim and RJ. That was a great session. Great to hear you talk to each other. Thanks everyone for coming. I am now blanking on when our next, I know it's Dan DiPiero and Christine Capitola talking about improvisation in everyday life. The date is evading me. It's not for a few weeks, right? Does any of my colleagues have?
Yeah, it's March 20th.
March 20th. Okay. So we will see everyone, I hope, many of you back here at on March 20th. Thanks again. Have a great night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was great.